today's webinar. So a couple of housekeeping rules before we get started. Please make sure that your name is entered in Zoom so that when you ask a question, we know who you are. We will have 30 minutes of presentation, and then the last part of the webinar will be Q&A, so you can use the Q&A box to ask your questions to the speaker. Please also let us know which organization and country you're from in your question, and I will choose the questions to read out to ask to the speaker. If you have any questions for technical support, you can use the chat function in the webinar. And also, please note that we are recording this webinar and it will be available afterwards on the EMB website and YouTube channel, and it's also being live streamed at the moment. So the topic of today's webinar is marine protected areas in the European Union. So this is linked both to our recent document that was published at the end of last year on Navigating the Future 6, placing the ocean within the wider Earth system. This is the part of the flagship series of the European Marine Board, taking a wide-looking view at marine science and future research priorities, and also to the EMB Ambassador program. So with that, I will also introduce our speaker. So we have with us here today Juliette Biquet. She's a PhD student at CCMAR in Portugal, and also affiliated with CNRS, CRIOB, and INRAE in France. She was an EMB Young Ambassador between 2022 and 2024. And she was also co-chair of the Ocean and People chapter for the Navigating the Future 6 working group. So with that, I will pass over to you, Juliette, for the presentation.
Yes, thank you so much, Brit. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much to the European Marine Board for having me. So I'll start right away, just the time that I share my screen. You should be able to see my screen now, right? So let's take this as the start of a conversation about marine protected areas in the European Union. So I'll be focusing on the research I have been conducting as part of my PhD research. And so I'll be talking about what these MPAs are and what they're used for. So what does an MPA conversation start with? It starts with biodiversity. So as you can see here, we have rich marine biodiversity all over our EU seas, and it's important on its own, but it's also important for us because it shapes our climate, our coast, and it's also providing food for us. EU seas are also inhabited by many, many humans. Just in the EU, we have 22 coastal countries. And you can see on this map the estimated combined effects of human activities. So the redder, the higher the pressures on marine ecosystems. So what does it mean? First, at local level, it has impact. So for example, habitat destruction. But it also means global changes for the ocean, including ocean warming, deoxygenation, and acidification. And we are observing now these rapid changes, which directly affects marine biodiversity. So here, just very quickly, I wanted to show you these two indicators. So on this map, you can see the biodiversity condition of our sea. You can see that it's mostly light orange, showing moderate condition. But actually, if we zoom in on the conservation status of marine habitats for different seas here, you can see that it's mostly gray, unknown, or showing poor and bad conservation status. So to reverse these trends, we developed many policies in the EU, and I will be focusing on marine protected areas. So it might seem obvious to many of you what marine protected are, but it is actually not. There are different perspectives on what they are. A very common definition is that of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which states that marine protected areas are areas in the ocean, they're also volume of the ocean that we set aside for long-term conservation aims to protect and restore marine biodiversity. its value and its functioning. But if you ask other people, including the ones who are actually creating the MPAs, like policymakers, MPA managers, or fishers, they might tell you something different, that MPAs are also not only for conservation goals, but also for instrumental reasons, for economic benefits. By protecting the fish somewhere, you might help fishing more elsewhere. So there are these different expectations about marine protected areas. But overall, they're expected to be spaces where we reduce the impacts of our human activities through regulation, education, and overall changing our practices. So MPAs, marine protected areas, MPAs, I will say MPA a lot, are created mostly through legal tools that recognize a space as an MPA. So now I'll be talking a little bit about where they come from and their wider policy context in the EU. So here you can see just a few selected legislation at various levels. So first, at international level, we have various treaties and regional conventions that set global targets regarding MPAs. At then EU level, we have many legislation because the EU has strong environmental competence. So there are first regulations that are directly applicable in EU countries, like the Common Fishery Policy. It makes fishing an EU competence, so it regulates fisheries through fishing efforts, setting quotas, etc. And then in the EU, you also have directives that are transposed, that have to be transposed into national legislation. They're not directly applicable. And here you have the example of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which requires member states to create their own strategy to reach good environmental status for marine ecosystems. And this can be done through MPAs. And then you have the Natura 2000 protected area network. So this network originates from two directives, the Birds Directive in 1979 and the so-called Habitats Directive in 1992. So these two directives include much more than the Natura 2000 protected area. They set a list of specific species and habitats for which member states have to implement measures, including the designation of protected areas under the Natura 2000 umbrella. So it's also interesting because it gives us a theoretical definition for MPAs in Europe and common requirements for EU states. And then at EU level, you also have some non-legally binding tools like the biodiversity strategies that we will be talking about later on. And then, of course, you have the national level with various national laws and all of these international frames that are then translated into the national framework. And then it varies greatly between countries in terms of who's deciding on regulations in MPAs and what are the requirements for different types of MPAs. So all of this in the EU resulted in more than 6,400 MPAs that you can see mapped here, and you can see also the delimitation of national waters in gray. But actually, many of these MPAs completely overlap. So if we keep only the MPAs that are especially unique, we remove all of the ones that are especially identical, we have only 4,860 MPAs. They make up to 11% of EU waters. And on this number, you might see from the European Environmental Agency that they cover 12.3% of EU waters. And I just wanted to mention this because I think it illustrates how difficult having a very simple number can actually be in the EU. So all of these MPAs, as we've just seen, are designated through different tools, national laws, European directives, etc. And as you can see on the map, they're, except for these big ones, they're mostly small and coastal, and they're designated for specific ecological features like dolphin or reefs. And about these MPAs, there's still a lot of unknowns. When I started my PhD, there were no assessments of what these MPAs were used for in terms of regulations. What regulations could we describe in these MPAs? And so it was difficult to have an idea of the consequences of these areas. So that was what the first part of my PhD was about. I was investigating the regulations within MPAs with the hypothesis that to protect and restore, we need to reduce impacts, notably through restricting activities with regulations. So the first step was to gather all of the regulations. So I worked on this mostly with my supervisor, Barbara Horta-Costa. And so I first gathered the MPA polygons that are reported by the states to the European Environmental Agency, which I could then overlap with different data sets that you can see here. First, I used the data gathered by protected seas from MPA legislation, MPA management plans. Then I used the data gathered in national marine spatial plans and the EMODNet database, which gives us information about activities at sea, not specifically to MPAs. And then I also used expert-based assessments that were available for some regional MPAs and for the Portuguese MPAs. And I could also assess the quality of these two data sets by comparing with these expert assessments. So then combining all of these regulations, I could assess the activity that were allowed, restricted, or prohibited for each MPA. So that was really quick, but if you want to have more information about all of the data sources, the methods, and the resulting data set, you can have a look at this paper. All of the information is in there. So let's have a look at some of the results. Here you can first see all of the categories of activities that I considered. So fishing, transport, mining, etc., up to anchoring and infrastructure. And you can see in terms of MPA coverage, how much we could describe regulations or authorizations for these activities. So we could mostly describe regulations for fishing, about 60%, and then we could almost not describe anything about anchoring, infrastructure, aquaculture within MPAs. So I think this illustrates well how much there's a problem with data regarding MPAs in the EU, because all of the data sources that I used are incomplete, and there is no global EU reporting scheme. But then if we zoom on these activities and we look at what regulations we could describe, so in red you have where activities were allowed in terms of MPA coverage again, in orange where they're restricted, and in blue where they were prohibited. So you can see that fishing and transport are highly allowed in the area for which we could describe regulations, while we found relatively higher prohibition rates for other activities. But all in all, we could not describe much, again, about all of these activities. Then, if we look at this data for a set of activities at the country level, here you have first fishing, dredging, dumping, non-extractive uses like recreational uses, and mining, which includes sand or pebble extraction. You can see that there are high differences between countries. So, for example, in terms of dredging and dumping, you can see that there are some restrictions in some countries because these activities have to undergo an authorization process, so then they're considered as restricted. You can see that they are particularly allowed in North Sea countries. You can also notice that in the Azores, in Portugal, offshore here, there are lots of prohibitions for activities. So again, that was pretty quick, but if you want more information about all of these activities in these MPAs, you can also check our publication that summarizes it all. And we also discuss recommendations. If we were to do an EU-wide database about regulations, what would we need to include? It's all in the paper. So that was specific for these categories of activities, but we can look at them all at once using one indicator, the levels of protection. So you might have heard about this one. It's called the MPA Guide Classification. It was developed by an international team led by Grosrud de Colvert, and it classifies marine protected areas based on the occurrence and the level of impacts of these 7 activities. So it classifies MPAs from fully protected, where almost no impacts of activities are allowed, to highly protected, lightly protected, up to minimally protected, where high impact of activities can occur. For MPAs where mining is allowed or even larger impacts are allowed, then they're classified as incompatible with objectives, with conservation objectives. But the thing is, you saw the data quality that we had access to for the EU, so we could not really do this because we didn't have access to the occurrence and impacts of activities. So I used the regulation information that I had access to, and I made two scenarios, and we made two scenarios of impacts. So in one scenario, we considered the lowest impact that an activity could have, and in the other scenario, we considered the highest impact it could have. So we ended up having two scenarios of protection levels, which gave us an idea of how far we could be from reality if ever we had the real impacts of activities. So I'll be presenting the results based on the lowest impact scenario. So here you have the results at EU scale. So you can see the MPA coverage here out of all EU waters. It does not mean that nothing is happening in this white area. It's just that I'm focusing on MPA coverage. You can also see on the map that the main level of protection is minimal protection in dark green. You can also see that if we search for the highly and fully protected areas, they're really small coverage of EU waters, about 0.1%. But if we look in terms of numbers of MPAs, we see them. It's just that they're very small. Then I wanted to show you some results in terms of types of MPAs, because as we've seen, there can be many legal tools to designate MPAs. So here I just selected a few, the ones that were designated under national legislation and the ones under Natura 2000 network. Because they highly overlap, in the first pie, you can see MPAs that can be both nationally or internationally designated in the Natura 2000 network, for example. And in the second pie, you see the MPA coverage only of the ones that are only designated through national tools. So you can see first that the blue area, the fully and highly protected areas, are mostly designated under national legislation. And if we remove all of the coverage that is both designated under national tools and Natura 2000, we lose all of the dark gray. We lose all of the MPAs that are classified as incompatible. So it means that it's not because you add up layers of legislation of different types of MPAs that you have higher protection levels. Then, just to zoom in quickly on some of these national legislation designations, here you have the sanctuaries, the reserves, the national parks, which are usually expected to show quite high level of protection. And they do, relatively, we find higher levels of protection in these areas. But we also find low protection levels in all of these designations. And this is a bit more technical, but for the people who have been using IUCN categories are reported by the countries themselves. And we found the same results. We found low protection levels across all of the IUCN categories. There's one last thing I wanted to show you about protection levels, and we didn't talk about this yet. So the ocean is divided in different jurisdictions. Here on this map, you see the national waters again, and you see different shades of blue. Because oceans are divided in national waters are divided into nearshore, territorial sea, and then the rest of the economic exclusive zones that can go up to 200 nautical miles, but it varies depending on how close your neighbor is. And there are different legislation that can apply in these areas, especially in the EU. So if we look at the distribution of protection levels across these different jurisdictions, we see that the blue, the fully and highly protected areas, are only located in nearshore waters and territorial seas. So first, this shows that there's less interest in protecting offshore ecosystems in the EU, but there's also a reason that can explain this. It's because of the common fishery policy that I mentioned earlier. Again, it makes fisheries an EU competence. And actually, for a state to regulate fisheries in one of its MPAs, the state needs to negotiate these restrictions at EU level by submitting a joint recommendation measure to the Commission. So it gets quite complicated. And actually, most EU states have not engaged in these negotiations. So fisheries restrictions are mostly, at least in MPAs, they're mostly located in territorial and neutral waters. Again, there are other tools to regulate fisheries. I'm only focusing on MPAs here. So to sum up these results, here you can try to see on the map the highly and fully protected MPAs in blue. But we have seen that they're coastal, they're small, and they're mostly designated under national designations. This might be an overestimation, actually, because we are using the scenario with the lowest impact possible for activities, but also we're assessing their protection levels based on the legal framework. These regulations, they need to be enforced, controlled, and we know that many MPAs do not have the means to do this. So from all of the results I have shown, it is clear that overall MPAs provide little regulations from activities that could be highly impactful to biodiversity. But honestly, at the beginning of my PhD, I thought they would all be incompatible. And it is not the case. MPAs do have restrictions over activities. And also impactful activities are just not occurring everywhere. But at the EU level, it actually makes sense that they show little regulations. First, because there is strong EU environmental policies, but it's very flexible. It does not have any specific requirements in terms of regulations, in terms of measures that we should have in these MPAs. So it's up to the state. And then environmental legislation in the EU are also contradicted by many policies favoring economic development and by other regulations like the common fishery policy that makes it even more difficult to develop regulations within MPAs. And finally, I think it also makes sense because most of the MPAs in the EU are aimed at being non-exclusive of humans and their activities. And in the EU, this was translated into low protection levels. MPAs in the EU are made for and by economic actors, and this is illustrated, for example, by the Natura 2000 areas in many countries, or also by reserves that are made from the very beginning for fisheries benefits. Again, I want to point out that this is based on the legislation, and there are many people working in these MPAs, and we cannot see, there's a great part of their work that we cannot see from legislation alone. Now, this might be changing because we're currently in a highly active political moment for MPAs. You might have heard of the EU biodiversity strategy, in which the European Commission has defined two key non-legally binding targets. First, it aims at 30% of MPA coverage, which is twice what we have now, and it also aims at effective management in these MPAs. It also aims at 10% of street protection, and the Commission's working document states that it should be 10% of street protection per sea region in the EU. It also considers street protection as fully and legally protected areas where natural processes are left essentially undisturbed from human pressures and threats. Now, as I said, these are non-legally binding targets, so member states, it's up to the countries. They were encouraged to make pledges with regards to this strategy, but very few states have engaged, have done so, especially with regards to protected areas and street protection. I also wanted to point out the position of the European Commission. You might have heard that it changed. 2 years ago, they published the Marine Action Plan, which was encouraging member states to ban bottom trawling, especially in Natura 2000 areas. And the latest communication, the so-called Ocean Pact, now argues for a case-by-case approach with regards to fisheries measures in MPAs. All of this is happening in parallel of many other legislation change in the EU, there will be revision of key directives that you can actually take part in if you're interested. And also it will be happening in parallel of the implementation of the so-called restoration law. It's actually a regulation, and now you know what that means. And it's quite strong because it sets legally binding restoration targets for member states. So all of this, I think, is super ambitious. So it might lead to change, but I think we should stay cautious because member states have shown that they can find their own ways of doing things. And here are a few examples. You might have heard of bottom trawling bans in different EU countries. For example, in Sweden, there were public an announcement to ban bottom trawling from territorial waters and then from MPAs. From my understanding now, the ban will be taking place in MPAs within territorial waters, with possible derogation. For other countries that you might have heard of Denmark and France announcing bottom trawling bans in MPAs. Now it's clear that they're targeting areas with the lowest fishing effort, most probably to avoid conflict. So why are they doing this? Well, because all of these targets and objectives are highly contested. There's a lot of opposition. And this is what I have been investigating in this last year of my PhD. I have been investigating this in France, so French MPA politics, by conducting interviews with key national stakeholders. I am finishing writing this up, so I'll just highlight a few key results regarding the stakeholders involved, what their position are, and their strategies. First, the first key result is that they all deplored a lack of participation in decision processes for regulations in MPAs. They all reported in interviews that they felt basically powerless, which they're not really. But it's true that there are lots of backdoor politics, which means that decisions are happening outside of the public eye with a very limited set of stakeholders. And this has led actors like experts, environmental NGOs, and most of the socio-economic sectors to engage with MPAs through other means, especially through communication, whether it is in MPA committees or through medias, so that they can defend their position. And they have very different positions because there are two big models that are defended in France and in the EU more generally. So first, environmental NGOs and a few experts are arguing for a systematic approach for MPAs so that we would systematically restrict activities within MPAs, while most of the public authorities and socioeconomic actors defend a case-by-case approach in MPAs. One thing that I wanted to highlight, because you might be familiar with it, is that they all demanded science-based decision-making. But then the interesting thing is that they disagreed on what science and what scientists are valid and legitimate to participate in these decision-making processes. So that was a clear result. Science is part of politicization of actors and of their political strategies. Actors, most of them, are increasingly taking part in technical work, including environmental and economic assessments, to engage with MPAs and with decisions related to MPAs. They use this scientific work to contest and to defend their own position, so that using this work, they can defend the precautionary principle, they can ask for more investigation, which delays the measures, and they can mobilize or delegitimize some of these technical assessments. All of these are political strategies that are clearly used to drive what is happening or not happening in French MPAs. Finally, I wanted to highlight the role of public authorities because to me, from these interviews, they clearly adapted their strategies to avoid conflicts. First, by taking blurry commitments, by delaying implementation of MPA-related targets, and by making contradictory statements so that they could fit all expectations from various stakeholders. And here I think it's important to consider history and the relationships between actors. And we can take the example of Natura 2000 in France. When this network was implemented, they were sold as protected areas that will not involve any measures related to fisheries. It is now driving the largest evaluation of fisheries impact in France, and it is clearly driving measures that will be taken for biodiversity in these MPAs. So there's a clear issue, a clear trust issue that came out from the interviews. Socioeconomic actors expect that that kind of thing will happen again for everything that public authorities are now saying. So it's clearly driving their position regarding any MPA decision or announcement. And facing these different positions from the public authorities, most actors preferred to use institutionalized dialogue to push for their own position regarding MPAs. But they're actually engaging more and more in public campaigning, in building coalitions, because their previous strategies were not working. A very small set of fisheries representatives, and of environmental NGOs are even seeking public confrontation with the state representatives, even including different kinds of violence, so that they can really push for decisions and push for their own positions. And a very interesting thing in this study is also that through MPAs and through what's happening with regards to these MPAs, actors are forcing other questions on the table, which are what activities do we want in which part of our seas, and who is to decide and how. So that was a really small teaser of this work, and I'll keep you posted for the publication where I'll discuss in details these strategies and their consequences. And in particular, I argue that we need to embrace the political dimensions of MPA decisions, which cannot fully be answered by science, because we want different things. Actors want different things, and I argue that we need to address these disagreements and that MPAs could provide spaces for this democracy. And I discuss how they can be redesigned to share power, to build on past mistakes, and overall to frame environmental justice. So I will just end this by another teaser, because I am now investigating how 3 member states are implementing the strict protection target from the EU biodiversity strategy. I'm investigating how this is happening in France, Sweden, Spain, and a region in northern France. So if you are involved in any of these countries, please reach out so we can have a chat. And I will be looking at similar processes, how actors have been interacting with these decision processes, and what strict protection will result from these political processes. I hope I wasn't too long. Thank you again to the EMB for having me for this. And I wanted to thank all of the people who have been working with me, especially my supervisors, Juliette Young and Barbara Ortega. And just one last thing, we will share the slides so you can have access to all of the literature that I was referring to.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Juliette. That was really, really interesting insights. Yeah, I learned a lot about MPAs. So just for the audience, you can put all of your questions for Juliette in the Q&A box, and then I will keep an eye on that. So I will start with a couple of questions while we wait for more to come in. So I'm wondering, this question is actually from Fernanda from the Secretariat. So thinking about the future of MPAs and how they might need to change and adapt due to climate change. Do you have any governance recommendations for that? I mean, it seems like even establishing them in a proper way in the first place is very, very challenging. So how do you see that the impact of climate change on the future of MPA governance?
I think it's very difficult because right now MPAs are not, as you just said, they're not really flexible because it takes so long to agree on where we're going to put the MPA. Like for example, in France, they take quite a lot of time to agree on very wide objectives. Sometimes it takes like 5 to 10 years to agree on this. And then they need to agree on specific measures. So imagine if you have to, well, they should be doing this very regularly anyways, but imagine if everything's changing very quickly, the current governance systems are not adaptable at all.
Yeah, yeah,
So what can we do? I don't
yeah.
know.
It's
I mean,
difficult.
overall, we need to change the whole governance systems of
Yeah.
MPs. Because they're not working, stakeholders are not satisfied with their role in it and with the resulting measures and their effects. So that's definitely a factor that should be included, but it requires enormous
Yeah.
means, right, in terms of people and time that we can dedicate to reviewing
Yeah.
and adapting MPAs. I think it was 2 years ago that there was a clear answer from the European Commission. If anyone knows better, just interrupt me. It was at least in the Natural 2000 newsletter, it was clearly stated that Natural 2000 areas could be revoked because of climate change.
Okay.
If it's proved that the species or the habitat the site has been designated for is not there anymore, or it's not an important site for them anymore, then you could remove the Natural 2000 area.
But I imagine that process would also take some time. So yeah, but it's I think also maybe there's a need to raise awareness of this in the national governments in charge of designating the MPAs and regulating the activities, like of the need to take into account climate change and not just so that they know it's something important. I mean, there's enough challenges as it is, but that's definitely going to change things in the future. So
Yeah, and
yeah,
MPAs are not the only answer. I mean, you could have measures that move with the species or that are not MPAs,
yeah,
other tools.
yeah, yeah.
Keep your MPA where it is to protect what is there.
So tools that are less static. Yeah.
And then Ana Maria Adam was saying, or we just need to
Yes.
support the evidence that Natura 2000 cannot be based on specific species, but in marine ecosystems, yes.
Yeah. Is that the first question?
No, that was a comment that came on later.
Oh, in the
And
chat. Okay.
then there was a question from, sorry if I mispronounce, Slavomir Sagan, on
Yeah.
Baltic MPAs. And actually, I will put the link for the protection levels here, because if you have a look at figure 2, I can share my screen, actually. You can
Okay.
see the changes. You can see the differences between regions. And actually, yes, for Baltic MPAs, we could classify most of the MPA coverage. Here you can see that there's only 5% that we could not classify, which is, you can see the difference with other, for example, here in the Atlantic or in the Mediterranean. And then also for protection levels, you only need to know of highly impactful activities. You don't need to know all of the activities to have a protection level, right? So it's not because all of these MPAs are classified that we know of all activities. Because overall, it's also true for marine spatial plans. They're much better in the Baltic and in the North Sea. Same for EMODNET data. There's much more data in these regions compared to the Mediterranean, for example. But very often this data is not very detailed in terms of what uses we're actually talking about. They are areas that are just like general use,
Yeah.
which is not very useful. And then for anchoring and some infrastructures, that kind of data is not reported like in all of the European seas.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's answering your question.
Okay. So let's go now to the Q&A. So we'll go to the first question from Melis Sontot Marjorie. So I don't know these acronyms actually. Many SACs and SPAs. Is that
Yeah,
special
so these
protected
are
area?
special areas of conservation and
Yeah.
special protected areas. There are the different
Yeah.
stages that you can have, whether it's a site that a Natural 2000 designated under the habitats or the birds
Okay.
directive.
Okay. So many SACs and SPAs designated member states marine territory are still lacking management plans, oftentimes because of a lack of understanding of what is the best strategy or what the best strategy can be for each site, but they still count towards the 30 by 30 target. Do you believe that member states will tend to bypass implementing management plans once a 30 by 30 target is reached and give up on strengthening conservation goals locally?
So first, the 30 by 30 target, for those who are not aware, is part of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So it's an international treaty, and it aims at having 30% of seas, well, of the ocean that would be designated as MPAs by 2030, hence the 30 by 30. And then this was already the case for the previous agreement under that convention. There was the previous target for the seas, for the ocean, was 7%, I think, or 10%, I don't remember. And then it was clearly reported by the Convention on Biological Diversity that even if many member states had reached the MPA target, most didn't have effective management, if any management at all. So this has happened, and I do not see any reason why it would not be happening. Because they're not it's not controlled by the treaty how much the management is effective. In the EU, there is a mention in the biodiversity strategy about effective management in the 30% of MPA. But this is a non-legally binding target.
Yeah. Is there any chance to make management plans legally binding?
Management plans are binding in some countries. Actually, I could find a reference for this. There's a document from the European Commission that reported in what countries it is mandatory for Natura 2000 areas at least to have a management plan. Because this is not mentioned in the Habitats and Birds Directive. So it is binding in some countries, but then the content of the management plan is not binding, right?
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
In
It's
France,
also
for example, sorry.
Can just be ticking the box to have the management plan, for example.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in France, for example, many of the management plans have wide objectives that then need to be translated somehow in measures.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know what to answer. These are clearly just political strategies to be able to report on some seemingly strong measures, which are then, when you look at the detail, it's not so engaging.
Okay, so we go to the next question on, we don't know who it's from, but so they say, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about compliance within MPAs, for example, with fishing. Was there any discussion that illegal fishing was still happening within MPAs where it was prohibited?
I don't know the scale of these illegal activities. Very often when we talk about this, we don't talk about EU waters though, but there are some work. I am thinking of an article from Margherita Pieraccini on some Italian MPAs where they're clearly working on enforcement of regulations in MPAs. So it is a clear issue, not only about fishing. I'm also thinking about recreational uses. When you prohibit access to part of a beach because a bird is nesting, for example, in some areas it's actually very difficult to control access to the beach. So I'm sorry, I don't know to what extent that is a problem, but I have heard from several stakeholders that it can be an issue, yes. And I mean, it is an issue worldwide, but in the EU specifically, I don't know.
Okay. Okay, so next question is from David Connor from the European Commission. He says bottom trawling has the most widespread effect on the seabed, but it could be more effectively managed by considering their spatial economic value. IC's advice to DG Environment in 2024 showed that 90% of economic value comes from only 30 to 40% of the area fished per meter per region. Have you considered how such spatial fishing patterns relate to NPAs, as there seems to be a mismatch between the two processes?
I didn't. There is some work happening regarding to the economic values of fishing activities, but it's not something I've looked into. What I can say though is that Denmark, for example, has targeted its bottom trawling bans that have now been publicly announced in areas where there's the lowest fishing effort, and they actually set an economic threshold. So they would only ban bottom trawling where it's where the fishing landing are below a certain economic value.
Yeah.
And then I think there are also other factors that could play. For example, in the region that I'm investigating in France, sometimes they can be just stakeholders can be, including fishers, and mostly their representatives, can be opposing any restrictions because they see it as an attack, but also because they see it as a strength in negotiation. So they can be negotiating some measures in sites that are more or less important to them so that they can then use that in another negotiation process. So they can, for example, say, we let you regulate that fishery there, so you have to leave us alone in that other area.
Yeah.
So I think whenever we look at these kinds of factors, there are other human factors that could be at play. So just to share a little bit about the kinds of things I'm investigating now, because I'm just avoiding your question, David. I'm sorry, but I don't have any answer to this.
Okay.
But you seem to already know, David, if you're quoting the ISIS advice then.
Okay, so next question from Caroline Magnalo. So aren't numerical targets for MPA surface areas a hindrance to the designation of these areas because they can scare off economic players, even though some players such as fishermen were the first to create protected areas?
I think it's a mix of both being hindering and leveraging factors, helping factors, because they do, because most of the time they're just announced like this and there's nothing else. Like they do that enormous public commitment about how we're going to ban, or for example, in Denmark, how they're going to have 6% of their seas that it's going to be strictly protected. And there's nothing else. There's no detail with the measure when it is announced. So then it drives a lot of anticipation and anxiety in actors, which will influence their position throughout the whole negotiation process. So even if when you arrive later with more details, they will remember that at the beginning they didn't know anything, that they were not involved in the target, that blah, blah, blah. Then these targets are also used by public authorities and by environmental NGOs to push for measures. Clearly in France, for example, if there were not any targets for strong protection, it's not strict protection, strong protection, public authorities would not be driving, they would not be pushing for strong protection, even if they're pushing for some specific measures in terms of strong protection. So it can be used by some economic actors, but I think the way they're used most of the time, they're just announced like this with no detail. It sometimes looks like nothing was prepared, and I can tell you that from France, the France investigation I have been doing, it is the case. And announcements are made where there's no actual planning on what we're going to do. So this is clearly a hindering factor.
Yeah, okay. So next question. So this is from Lola Montjarret. She's first year master's student in marine science at Sorbonne University in France. And she says, thank you for your interesting talk. Speaking of taking climate change into account in MPAs, how are climate models and ecological predictions currently used in their design and implementation? How can we improve the use of models and communicate their importance more convincingly to decision makers?
It probably depends on the countries and how much they have these models ready and where they are in the MPA processes. Because in many European countries, all of MPAs have been designated. I mean, they might designate more, but for example, in terms of requirements for the EU, I mean, they should be designated more MPAs given that the EU is targeting 30%. But when you look at the requirements and how the Commission is going after countries, many countries already have a lot of MPAs and they might not be designating more, especially if we don't push them. So, sorry, I'm getting a bit lost in answering this question. Concretely, now they're in France, because you were saying that you're a French student. In France, they're almost not used at all. Because they're using what they can in terms of habitat and species mapping. And it's already very complicated to know what habitats you have and what species you have. And it's contested all the time. When you have a first map, it is very likely that some actors participating in the MPA committee, for example, will answer that this map is not accurate, that it's too old, that blah, blah, blah. So just having the relevant technical knowledge of what is now is already very difficult. And I don't know how you can use these kinds of predictions in MPA committees, for example. Like I'm really talking at the local level here. I'm not sure how the different socioeconomic stakeholders will perceive maps that are made with a lot of, with hypotheses to make these predictions. And then at wider scale, I don't know. For example, as part of the European Commission evaluation work, I don't know how much they use these predictive work to, for example, ask states to review their MPA network. I don't know. That wasn't a very satisfactory answer. As you can see, I am not very involved with assessment of MPAs with the climate lens.
Yeah, I imagine it's something that should be considered more in the future, for sure. Yeah. I was also not an expert on this, so.
Yeah, I guess it could. I think we're at the very beginning of considering how we could use this in the political spaces that.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a couple more questions in the chat from my colleagues. So I have a question from Angel from the EMB Secretariat. So he says, with the BBNJ agreement most likely coming into force this year, there will be the possibility to designate MPAs beyond national jurisdiction. Are there any areas that you see as potential for an international MPA, and what activities should be allowed or restricted?
I don't know. I really focused on
outside of your expertise. Yeah.
Yeah, because just understanding what's happening in all of the 22 coastal states is already a lot. So I don't know much about BBNJ, and I don't know about particular areas that could be interesting to designate. I think an interesting process could be that non-coastal states could also be part of these processes. And so this is going to be like pretty new, and we're going to see what they argue for.
Yeah. But I think that's also a very difficult question. Yeah.
But it's not a question for me. I'm sorry, but
yeah.
not the one.
Okay, and Slavomir, we already answered Slavomir. Okay, and then Anna says that you mentioned that in France it takes them up to 5 to 10 years to decide on measures for MPAs. Who is they, and who is involved in this conversation at the national level?
Yes, who are they? So So in France, it depends on the type of MPAs because you have different types of designation, and then the decision process associated with it is different. So for the highest levels of protections, which are natural reserves, it's decided mostly at national level with the advice of a nature protection council, and then they are they are still consultation with local and national stakeholders, and then once it's designated, there is a council that works on this. And then I'll focus on two other types of MPAs. We have what we call marine natural parks, and here you have a management council where chosen people, chosen organizations can sit. This is validated by the ministry. And you have socioeconomic stakeholders, you have some environmental NGOs, and you have public authorities. So for example, you have the Regional Fisheries Committee, you have the aquaculture, well, not aquaculture, a oyster and etc. Committee. But you also have mayors, regional politicians as well, just to give you a few examples. And they have power to vote on some decisions. They have the power to make advice that is then mandatory to follow, which will influence what's happening in terms of regulations in the MPAs. And then you have in Natural 2000 areas, you have a management committee. And here there are ongoing fisheries analysis related to the risks that are posed by fisheries. And these in here you have the regional authorities, so we call them the préfect, but they're the regional. It's the decentralized state ruling these management committees. You have fisheries representative, again the regional committees. They participate in the technical work because they provide assessment of fisheries activities that will be used for the analysis of fisheries stakes and the measures. And then you have the French Office of Biodiversity, which is a state agency for biodiversity. You have the regional representatives that also contribute to these technical assessments by providing a state of the art of the ecosystem in the area. And so then they discuss in groups with all of the people that want to participate from the management committee, and they negotiate what measures. First, they have to validate the state of the art in terms of fisheries stakes and ecosystem, and then they need to negotiate what measures would be acceptable based on the level of impact. Normally, they should not be negotiating. There's a decision tree that they should be following. And then you have the regional authority, so the centralized government, who arbitrate basically what measures should be taken given the different assessment and the different positions from the French Office for Biodiversity and the Fisheries Committee. I hope that was not too chaotic and you got your answer.
Sounds very complex. So there's one more question kind of related to this as well, and then we will close. So from Kelly Saunders, is there anything policymakers can do better to get stakeholders on board with MPA's rollout?
What does rollout mean?
Implementation, management, yeah. Well,
I guess this would be very country specific. So since I'm really in the middle of what's happening in France, I will answer for France. In France, as I was saying, the targets have been announced without any clear plan of what was going to happen. There was very little participation. And all of these different targets, you remember when I was talking about everything happening in parallel? For the restoration regulation, states have to write their national plan on how they're going to do this. They also have to commit to other requirements from the different directives. And usually this is not coordinated. So, for example, they hear stakeholders participating in this management committee, they hear that now they need to be taking measures for fisheries because of Natural 2000. But they also hear that there's a strong protection target happening. and that there's also the restoration regulation happening, and that France is working on a plan that will set legally binding targets that might restrict even more activities. They hear all of these different things, but in the management committee of MPA, we're like, no, we need to focus on just these fisheries measures that we need to take from Natura 2000. So I think there are many things that are happening in parallel, and just making a plan of what has to be done and how it needs to be done for stakeholders to understand what will be asked of them and how much regulations will be taken and how is already a key step for policymakers. Like, just plan and be honest of what's going to happen, because it will have consequences on anything you want to do next.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I talked about the governance system. It's not a democratic system in many NPAs, and that is a really big problem, and it needs to be changed.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much, Juliette. I really learned a lot in just this 1 hour. It's really great to hear about what you've been working on, and the plans for the next steps as well. So thank you. And I have one more slide that I will show. Okay, there we go. So this is the next webinar, is on the 21st of August. The topic will be valuing ecosystem-based fisheries management in Malta, a discrete choice experiment to elicit preferences and willingness to pay. So the speaker will be Gilmore Camilleri. He's the chief economist at the Malta Fiscal Advisory Council and also a PhD student in economics at the University of Malta. And he's also a project partner in the EcoScope project, which EMB is also involved in, about ecosystem-based fisheries management. So that's now open for registration. So we hope to see you there next month. And so thank you everybody for joining us, and enjoy your afternoon. Bye-bye.